Hi, everybody. My name is Dan Schneider.
And I'm Jana Bernard, and we are your hosts for Still New York.
Today's special guest is a person who is a native New Yorker who went to school at Bard College. He then started his own circus and has since become a designer of public spaces and a consultant to major municipalities around the world on how to design and produce public spaces that can house cultural events.
Speaking of cultural events, one place that many exciting events take place is Central Park. So we're going to hit you with our New York City fun fact of our episode, which is that Central Park actually measures in 843 acres. That's an incredible piece of land right there, guys. It actually is so large that it is larger than the Principality of Monaco.
Wow, that's big.
Big
And
park.
it was a big park, and it's also the first public landscape park in the United States. And it was designed in 1857 by landscape artists Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Law. And it is the place where so many memories have been made, so many events have been produced, and it's been captured in so many movies, television series, and in all kinds of media.
And it's where I've pet so many dogs. Central Park is the best. Speaking of Central Park, our next guest is, as Dan was saying, is a very accomplished producer and has produced cultural festivals for the New Yorker, environmental summits on 3 continents, classical concerts in the White House, rock festivals in muddy fields, and he's been the city's producer for the 3 largest Central Park concerts ever, and for dozens more with crowds measured in the tens of thousands. So we're excited for you to meet our next guest and hear this engaging and insightful conversation that we had next on Still New York. Chris, I was going to ask you, because we were talking before about how you got started as a ringmaster in the circus and how you started a circus. How did that come to be?
Well, I had been bad in a previous lifetime. And there was a sort of a punishment thing.
Gotcha.
I was a nerdy, 12 or 13-year-old, and I got infatuated with magic, and I did magic all the time. And living in New York City, and I spent a lot of time going to 2 somewhat legendary magic stores, neither of which still exist. And learning tricks and then doing tricks. And I did, I performed like as a teen, I performed for little kids, and I actually had quite a lucrative ongoing business. And then I met a guy who was a counselor at the camp I went to, who had come out of Ringling Brothers as a clown, and he started teaching us clowning. And I took to that because it was somewhat my nature. And so then I developed this whole sort of magic clown act persona, which I've never left behind. And so I did a lot of that. And my infatuation in my high school years, was very much with what we used to call nostalgia, which was the movies and the stuff, particularly of the Depression era and earlier. So I was completely taken with like straight, theater, but I did a lot of theater, but it was sort of via the lens of watching old movies. And then when I got a little older, I got much more into countercultural theater performance happenings. It was like, that was the era of like wacky happenings and performance stuff. And I did a lot of that and was very political, and went to Europe and joined a group of odd eccentric performers, doing rather political street theater mostly, but also a non-street theater, and music. And the work that we were doing, which was incredible for me to have done, after a while it didn't suit me because the tone of the work was very much kind of beat the shit out of your audience to make them wake up, right? There was a general anger of with sort of a rage at the culture. And
almost like protest performances,
well, I
or
mean, there's ways of protest. I mean, there's introspective or philosophical protest. There's, on the street rage and protest. There's bread and puppet theater doing, soft and gentle poetic protest. And for me, the sort of like smack the audience in the face thing was no way. It wasn't my way. Like that's not who I am. But also it didn't feel like we were getting through to people because you were alienating people. So I wanted to come up with a sort of less alienating form of political theater. And so I went back to my roots and sort of recreated a circus that had layers of meaning in it as a way of coming with the friendliest form of theater, so we could tour, rural countryside towns, and still, entertain and get people a whole sort of different levels of messaging. So the circus was, it wasn't as innocent as it sounds.
Yeah, you used it. It sounds like kind of as like an engine for more cerebral art in a way.
It was a cultural tool, and I was not alone in this. There were great folks that I learned from, like the San Francisco Mime Troupe. If you don't know who they are and you're interested in stuff, look them up. But also it was Brechtian theater that I was really interested in, and the mystery plays of the medieval times and all that stuff. Sort of, and working, and I worked for Big Apple Circus as a production manager, and I did some other circus work. So it all sort of like percolated into this thing. But that is a long time ago.
Very cool. That is all very interesting. And I was going to ask you is how did you get then from the circus and this incredible life working in the circus and creating circus shows to then becoming New York City's director of special events?
That was like somewhat an odd and easy step. So I ran a circus. I ran my own circus for basically 5 seasons. I was, I did this. I often say I did it just out of pure like youthful will and ignorance, because I would never do now what I did then. I just wouldn't have taken it on. And literally, I was like 22, 23. My hair started going gray. I mean, my hair has been this color for a very long time too. And so when I finally, threw in the towel, I moved to Woodstock. And I was just, I was running a youth center and, doing tree work and, teaching circus and theater to kids and stuff. And I got a call from a woman who sort of headhunted me, who was then the director of special events for New York, and asked me if I would be interested in coming back to the city to create new free public events. And the thing about my circus was that every show we did was free to the public. It was part of my manifesto. Like, we had manifestos back in those days. And part of the manifesto was like, we're not charging the public. So I had to come up with ways of monetizing the shows in other ways. So the idea that I could go to New York City and create free public events in city parks was irresistible. And so I did that. And then I went and created free events and public events. And then I ultimately became the director of citywide events. And I stayed longer than I wanted to, but I stayed because I knew that if I stayed for a while, I would learn to produce anything, that I would not be afraid to do anything. I would get it. And that's sort of what happened. Through working with parks, I did everything from, our office was the lead office for the city for the New York City Marathon. I was the city's producer for like the biggest concerts that ever happened, as well as like 8 million other little crazy happenings all over the city. So you just, I just learned, as they say, earn while you learn.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Can you talk about some of your favorite events specifically in that job, or
in that era? Again, a long time ago, but my favorite events, I mean, it's hard not to, be in love with the big ones. The big, I was, one of my claims to fame was that there was a hiatus of major shows in Central Park, which, by the way, no longer happen. But there had been, Dan, you are probably old enough to remember this, my friend. There had been a riot of wilding youth during a Diana Ross concert in Central Park.
I remember it well, yeah.
Yeah, and that put the old kibosh on any major events on the Great Lawn, mostly because the Parks Commissioner, who I will name by name, Henry J. Stern, was an out-and-out racist. And so he didn't want to do any other concerts and of scale on the Great Lawn. It was just sort of a community of fear. And so when David Dinkins became mayor and I was elevated to director, the then somewhat wonderful Parks Commissioner, Betsy Gottbaum, was asking, what do we do now? What should we be doing here? And I said, we should go back to doing major events. And with her blessing and support, I got to pull together a number of events. The first one was Earth Day 1990, which was huge. It was 500,000 people. And then, a number of others, there's Paul Simon's Graceland Central Park concert, Pavarotti concert, numbers of those kind of things. So they were pretty wonderful. Here's a moment for me that was a really incredible moment, which was at the Paul Simon show. It takes many months in the making, and you kind of never know like what's going to happen, right? And this is the wonderful thing about doing the kind of event work that I used to do. It's one shot deal. It's not like theater where you can mess up your opening night and keep working on it. It's not like film where you can reshoot. It's like, oh, look, several 100,000 people are here. What's going to happen? And so it was we were whatever mid show, and it was phenomenal. It's just phenomenal. And I climbed up the midfield tower. We have several towers, and this one was a control tower. And the back of it there was a jumbotron video, this old school jumbotron, and there was a light tower and sound. Everything was mixed, and I think it was 40 feet. I think it was four levels of stack. So I was way the hell up above this crowd, and I'm on 2 walkie-talkies, blah blah blah, and they died. I'd been on for hours, and I just was at the top. And it was just like this wafts of energy. It was just like this incredible, palpable wind of positive, just coming off the crowd. And it was like, it's like those moments when you're like, oh my God, incredible stuff when it happens right. But
that must be so exciting, having so many people there, and also knowing that you as a collaborator and as an artist are responsible for coalescing all these different groups of people into one spot to kind of take on that collective energy of an artist or an event.
You're building an incredible community. Whenever you do these things, you're building a moment. And it's the same thing with scale has, scale has a power to it. You can't deny it, but it is quality over quantity. And you can go to let's face it, you can go to a great, party with 50 people, or a great dinner party with a half a dozen people. And when it clicks, you've built this thing. You've built this thing that like everyone has now got this bond, and that's a big part of what's incredible about doing this kind of work is you have the ability to create this great bridge between people.
And memories. I remember that concert. I think I was there, and some of the great concerts in Central Park, everything from the Philharmonic, I know Diana Ross had to build a playground as compensation for the wilding and the whatever happened after her concert. But I remember one of the first concerts I went to was in Central Park. It was at the Woolman Rink, and it was Happy and Artie Traum were opening up. And they're Woodstockers, as you know. Yeah. And I sat next to their mother in the front row. It was my first concert. They were opening up for, and now I can't remember, for the band, who are also from Woodstock. Right. And so they're iconic in Woodstock,
There was a great thing about the Woolman Rink shows. I don't know if you remember this, but they had a really weird system at Woolman Rink, which is they didn't have enough space to project the lights. They didn't have enough throw. So they developed a system where they threw the lights from behind the stage onto a mirror that was angled over the front of the stage, right? So that the lights bounced off the mirror and down. What that meant was that if you were a stoned high school student like we were, you could go to the show, sit on the rocks behind the band, and watch it in the mirror, right?
Wow.
Yes.
Well,
Many, many an evening spent that way.
no,
Anyway.
it was great. The culture in New York. I mean, part of our series, Still New York, is about why New York is important and will always be important as a haven for artists, for entrepreneurs from all over the world, for dreamers, people who want to chase their dream and their passion, and how it is a spiritual thing that people need it to know that it exists. And those kind of events are things that advertise it, like
But,
the marathon, like these
do you
concerts.
really think that people need New York? I mean, New Yorkers need New York, but I mean, right? I mean, New Yorkers need New York, and to some extent, the I don't even know if it's true. I was going to say, to some extent, the financial community needs New York because the financial community needs a base, and it happens to be in New York. But the cultural community, which has always been in New York, may not necessarily need New York anymore. It may move. It may decentralize. I mean, this is the moment we're living through. And actually, a decentralized cultural life might actually be very healthy for the country. There's no reason that if you live in, pardon my French, bumfuck West Virginia, and you can't ever see a show that isn't of caliber, that if God forbid there was a way to see a show near you because it wasn't all on Broadway, that wouldn't be a bad thing. And if the economy could support it, I don't know.
I think you're right. There's, and Steve Case who used to form the AOL, and he has a nonprofit that's called Rise of the Rest, where he's talking about decentralizing finance and culture.
Mm.
He's made an argument for that. Then it might be better in terms of sustainability. But historically, New York, look at all the movies about New York. Look at all the songs about New York. It's been the first stop for most
It has
immigrants.
been. I mean,
Right.
not to pick a fight with you guys who are doing the show about New
No,
York.
no, we're open to
I'm a
suggestions.
third generation New York City boy. Okay,
Okay.
but I can recognize that things change. I mean, when you think of even New York as a physical, Manhattan as a physical city, that but when I was born, there was no rival. There was no rival. We had this incredible, it was Oz, man, right? Right now, I mean, someone just sent me a picture. They were in Panama City. I'm like, look at that, Panama City. Who knew? Half of the world is full of these remarkable buildings and remarkable cities and urban environments, some of which dwarf New York City now, right? And Manhattan as a viable cultural entity, kind of ruptured in the last decade. Hence, everyone moved away, right? And then COVID hit, right? So then the creative community, right, can come and live in places like Woodstock. And I think what's interesting is that that's not only New York City, it's every city. I mean, I communicate with an artist, a really fascinating guy who's a Brit. And he's telling me the same thing. Here, I'll give you a little more light. He's telling me the same thing about there that I'm feeling here, which is that, half of London has moved to the countryside, right? That's a new reality. And I don't think it's something that is likely to go away.
And it's also going to be hard to get people to come back. A lot of our young advisors who are arts workers had to move out of New York because the rents were so high and cost of living, and especially when they weren't working. And a lot of them have second jobs in service industry for hospitality, etc. So that wasn't happening. So yeah, I think there's going to be a change. It'll never be the same. And perhaps it isn't necessary, but maybe there'll be something else. But I don't see any other city in the world that's going to take over that position. I don't know.
As a cultural leader?
And also the infrastructure. Look at all the museums, Broadway. I mean, you have the West End in London, but for example, we have an advisor who just opened up the new, he was in the original London cast for Girl from the North Country about Bob Dylan and his songs, and now it's opening up on Broadway. So there's just that sort of, and also in people's imaginations.
I think you're right about the infrastructure too. I think that's a good point. The infrastructure, particularly things like the Met. They're not going to.
The Metropolitan Museum, I take it, as opposed to the Metropolitan Opera. Both are huge. I mean,
right.
Lincoln
No,
Center.
I meant the museum. Yeah.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
And I think kind of going off of what you were saying before, And I think it's great that there is more art spreading to other communities now, and I think that's a wonderful thing. And I think that doesn't take away from the magic and the beauty of New York. And also, going off what you were saying before, the nostalgia of it is like New York will always hold this weight as the artistic capital of the world, I think, actually. In a sense.
I just don't think it's true. I don't think New York, I think, there's a certain kind of nostalgia that may persist for a generation or three, but like shit changes. I mean, Rome isn't Rome anymore, things change. And I think we have to.
That used to be the cultural capital of the world. You're right. Rome was the cultural capital of the world for a while.
Right. I mean, it was hard to conceive that Rome would fall, I think that I think the other thing I was going to say, and I think it comes to mind is, so as you may know, and I now work I don't produce anymore. I work as a strategist and consultant on the development of public space. And I get invited by teams, usually led by landscape architects or urban designers, to contribute, thinking about particularly how to bring people together, how the spaces can function as a way to bring people together, how places can function programmatically, etc. So I'm working on a space with the team, and I can't be specific about who or what, but it's a very well-known and respected national team.
You could tell us. We won't tell anybody. I'm just kidding.
A very large project in New York City, in Manhattan, right? It's a very large project in Manhattan. And we're working on the response. All these things are RFP based, and you work on a response. And there's this, and it's a mixed use development, i.e. there'll be business, there'll be residential, there'll be public space. And there's all this talk amongst the team and the developers. Well, we have to make it authentic New York, and it's got to feel like real. And I again, as a culture warrior and New York City boy, someone who spent 4 decades producing culture in the city and seeing the city change, I look around and say, oh, give me a break. How are we going to make this authentic New York? You are spending over $1 billion to develop this space, right? Right. And you're going to spend, and the rental on the space is more than $150 a square foot, right? And it's going to be one of the tallest buildings in the city. And you want the public spaces to feel authentic? Like, you got to be kidding me. And that's the story of the city right now, right? There's hardly a space left that feels authentic. Broadway, which is certainly authentically Broadway, doesn't feel authentic to me, right? It doesn't feel like New York City. It's an industry, and an incredible one. Most of what we would have considered authentic New York culture, growing up in New York, has left Manhattan, right? It's moved to Brooklyn and beyond, right? And now recently, really beyond, left the confines of the city. So
What defines, and I'm glad we're having this conversation, because I'm learning a lot from you, and I think that you provide such a unique perspective that's making me think about this more critically. But like, what defines New York authenticity? Because I'm there now, and I'm an artist, and I'm doing television production, and I'm singing, and I'm auditioning for Broadway shows, and it feels very authentic to me. And I'm ordering my pizza, and I'm going.
That's all fair. I mean, I think there's a certain sense of authenticity that would be stuff that would really bubbling up, right? I think when things would used to just bubble up, there would be small clubs, and there would be small galleries, and there would be clubs and music scenes that would develop, right? And that stuff was everywhere. Stuff was everywhere, right? And a lot of it was not that people didn't have commercial aspirations, not that people didn't want to live through their art, but there was a lot of very non-commercial endeavor, right? And there were places to live where you could afford to live. I mean, when I came out of college, I shared a loft downtown with someone for $400 a month, right?
Oh,
you know?
you're so lucky.
Well, I mean, and $400 was worth more than it is now, but it was like, okay, we could live in a loft for $400 a month, right? Yes, the bathroom was in the hall. No, we didn't care, right? And we could persist in making movies and play, improvisational music and run a circus. Um, you know, that basically doesn't happen in Manhattan anymore because it like everyone got priced out, right? Including the venues.
No,
Right.
it's true. One of our premises for our Still New York campaign is that we need to have affordable housing for arts workers. Otherwise, New York will lose its authenticity because that's what the trend has been for the last 10 or 20 years. The rents are just too high. Young arts workers like Jana just can't afford to live there. And if they and it was becoming very much uh, almost a playground for the rich. I know where I live in Hell's Kitchen, which is in the theater district, they built all these huge skyscrapers that are glass condos, and we don't know who's living there because sometimes it's just a tax shelter or it's a people from global elites are parking their money there, but they're not contributing to the community. So I think that is an issue, and the fact that zoning has just gotten out of hand, post Dinkins, with Giuliani and Bloomberg and
Yeah.
whoever the guys there now.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. So I mean, I think the larger point is, in a way, it's like we have to wait and see. But I do think that there's a certain kind of New York City hubris to feel like we are essential. New York will always live on as the core and heartbeat of culture. It's like not so much. Um, and really not. I mean, certainly not true for Manhattan. I mean, Manhattan would have to actually undergo a crash in order for what we were referring to as authentic, which really is a jive word. I mean, it's not really that it's authentic; it's that it has a somewhat more organic and egalitarian way of culture arising and arriving. Um, but
Let's talk about some of the Central Park events because I think that is, I mean, you must have great memories, great shows, everything from, were you there for Garth Brookstock?
Garth Brooks happened after I left, and
Okay.
it was after the Conservancy really clamped down on the scale of events. So Garth Brooks was limited, check my numbers, but I believe it was limited to 50,000. There was a free ticketed event, and it was on the North Meadow, not the Great Lawn. And it was the second best one. I think the first, and it was also after my time, was Disney did Pocahontas premiere on the Great Lawn, and they did, I think, 75,000 free tickets. But previous to all that, there were no tickets. It was just free. I was after I left the Parks Department, I was the operations manager for the Papal Mass in Central Park, and we did 125,000 tickets. So I know exactly what 125,000 people looks like. Right?
Yeah, that's a lot. That is huge.
Yeah.
Wow.
And the other thing is, with those kind of events, that people aren't wasting tickets. It's not like you're giving out right. And there's like not a lot of drop off on Papal freebies. People come.
Is that the one where you had the Pope Mobile?
You always have a Popemobile. You
always had the Pope Mobile. Yeah.
I did this. You will appreciate this stupid story. So, after I did that, I got hired by a guy I used to do a lot of work with to produce the opening of Howard Stern's movie, which was at Madison Square Garden, and it was every bit as crazy as the Pope. And they decided they wanted Howard to arrive in the Popemobile and asked me if I could get it, which of course I can't, but I made a facsimile. I had a facsimile made of the Popemobile, and then I hired a bunch of dykes on bikes that were movie extras and an armored car, and we rolled them up 7th Avenue, and Howard arrived in a Popemobile.
These are amazing stories. I once saw Howard Stern at the Leopard. It used to be Cafe des Artistes. It was a couple of years ago, and he was standing in front of me and with his wife, I assume, and he kept turning around and looking at me, and I knew who he was, but I didn't, in New York, you don't go up to celebrities, it's not like LA. There's celebrities all over the streets. You don't bother them. So, but he was looking at me, waiting for me to say hello and, say, "Hey, aren't you Howard Stern?" But I didn't do that. So he was disappointed, I think. And the funny thing was, it was restaurant week. So I knew he was there for the whatever it was, 1999, or no, it was 2019 by then, 20.19 for a dinner, for a price fixed dinner. I knew he was there for the special.
Everyone likes a special.
Gotta love a special.
Gotta love a special.
But that's the thing about New York. You could just run into people on the street, and walking across the street, it has that economies of agglomeration that you can only have when you have enough people.
Yeah,
but it is dependent on the infrastructure. Look, if people don't go back to the subways because it's too dangerous, then New York is not going to come back. And that's
I think it was more dangerous in the 70s when I was using the subway to go to high school.
Yeah, that's what I'm told. I haven't been back since the pandemic. But I went back once and I saw some of what was going on particularly in the theater district, where they've put a lot of homeless people into the tourist hotels, which Mayor de Blasio did, which I think was not very well planned out. But going back to the question of public spaces, because that's become a big issue in New York, and open space in general, because they're building all these huge towers and breaking the zoning, everywhere from Soho across, the whole city. They just opened up this little island, for example, and that's the newest thing, and it's I think it was financed by Barry Diller in part, and IAC.
I actually had a fun meeting with Barry Diller about it when he was first starting. The director of the island is a friend, and she wanted me to talk to Barry about his cultural plans and all that, and so that was it was actually a very easy, very it was a real brainstorming, riffing kind of meeting.
He's supposed to be a very smart guy from what I hear.
Yeah, I would imagine so.
He's done pretty well.
He's done okay for himself.
But just running out of land. So I think a lot of it is going to be geographic. Brooklyn has become the new cultural headquarters in a lot of ways, with all the young people that have moved out there. You have
the reality of why Brooklyn is a matter of space and affordability. It's not about public space. It's about living space and incubator space. I think that New York City is 26,000 plus acres of parkland. It's the largest municipal park system in the country. There's plenty of public space to do stuff in, right? More and more, unfortunately, and this is a conversation also worth having about our fabulous city, more and more in the last 20 or 25 years or 30 years, the public spaces have been given over to conservancies and bids to run. So Madison Square Park is a great example. Madison Square, and they were all modeled on the success of the Central Park Conservancy. So Madison Square Park was less than desirable space, and it was in great disrepair. A conservancy was started. They, as Madison Square Park in the area was heating up, Danny Myers and a bunch of other business folks in the community chipped in. They raised a lot of money. They hired a woman named Deborah Landau, who's great, all very talented at running conservancies. She had run the City Parks Foundation, and they started a bid in a conservancy to run Madison Square Park, and they completely revived the park. I was involved in helping the early days create a music series. Danny Myers created the Shake Shack for the park, and the park was transformed.
That's always the most necessary part of any park.
Well, yeah, definitely.
For me, at least, is the most local Shake Shack.
Yeah, right. Well, the very first one was in Madison Square Park as part of the effort to revitalize the park. But, so that's all great, right? But the downside of that is that the parks are then controlled by basically private entities, even if they're not called private entities, even if the city has plays a key role in how the parks are run and the decisions that are made and the policies. they're still run essentially by third-party private organizations, even if they're not for profit. They're private organizations, and those organizations can make decisions about who performs, who gets to use the space, who doesn't. Um, there are good things and bad about that, but it has taken the space away from the public. Bryant Park is a wonderful example of how bad that can be. Bryant Park is run, the Bryant Park, in my perspective, very well run. Lots of great stuff happens there, but it is not run like a public park. It's run like a business, right? Central Park Conservancy has had a tremendous role in making Central Park, an absolute gem, right? But they do it in part by keeping certain populations and certain communities out of the park, right? This has gone on throughout the city, and in all of the major parks, and now it's beginning to happen more and more in Prospect Park. It makes it harder and harder for small theater companies, public artists, church organizations to do concerts. It makes it really hard for people to just walk in the door and do stuff. Parks are for the people, right? But not if they're run by organizations that want to keep the people out.
Yeah, good example. I totally agree. The privatization of public space is a problem, and the bureaucracy connected with it, having to go through one of these bids to get a permit to do an event, and even to get a softball field in Central Park is, you have to be connected. You have to be with a big corporation. It's
Or a
it's
private
become
school.
that where you could just go out before and do your event, or maybe get a permit, with no.
So but all of this is not really the case if you're in Queens. It's not really the case if you're in Bronx.
Forest Park, yeah, you can get a permit more easily
Right.
out there. So you think Manhattan is more difficult right now?
Well,
Has been.
it is more difficult. There's no question about it.
I remember when they formed the Bryant Park Business Improvement District, and my office at the time was a couple of blocks away, and they started having private security guards keeping us out of the park. So it was very strange that they are now handing the keys to the park over to corporations and their representatives.
It happens. It takes place. That imbalance happens in many ways. And now, particularly in the work that I'm doing on the development and strategies for public space, and particularly this year, everything has become about diversity and inclusion and creating equitable and democratic spaces, which has been good for me because I've been doing that for a long time, and people call on me to do it. So it's it's good for business, but it's one thing to say it. It's one thing to talk the talk. It's another to walk the walk. And we're testing that out in some of the projects that I'm involved in, to see how far we can get cities, or like I'm working with a bid in downtown Indianapolis, and it's a partnership between the city and the downtown bid. How far we can get them to really talk about the issues that they've had, talk about the bad history, talk about the exclusion, and to actually make strides and steps to change it, which involve making policy changes, involve spending money on things that they have historically not spent money on. It makes changes to policing. It makes changes to all these things. And those things, which don't sound like they might necessarily be connected to the creative culture, are integral to the creative, authentic culture of a city, right?
By the way, Halston was from Indiana, the designer Halston. I don't know if you saw the limited series on Netflix recently.
I haven't seen it, but I know it's out there.
It's amazing. I mean,
is it really?
I totally recommend it. And Ryan Murphy produced, and Ewan McGregor plays Halston unbelievably. But but that goes to the point of why New York was necessary for people who were outcasts. Halston was gay, but he didn't come out until he came to New York. And it was a place where outliers could congregate, and particularly people in the LBGT community at the time, they could come there and be accepted, and they could find their tribe, and artists could find their tribe. And I think, aside from the affordability issue, which we all know is an issue, putting that aside, the need for a place like New York where artists can congregate, and Portland was taking on that role for a while, where young people go to retire, I think they called it, or but and there's all these other little regional places. Um, but I think that I just mentioned, when you mentioned Indiana, I know Halston was from Indiana, even though he didn't have an accent. I guess he developed the New York accent intentionally. But the number of people from all over the world that have been attracted to New York, and just the mythology of go to New York, and it's okay to go with $10 in your pocket, you'll become a billionaire. So
But I
that
don't, but that was true. That was true, right? I mean, my grandfather got off a boat and literally sold apples on Orchard Street. Like, okay, so
well, my favorite story is, have you heard of Lenny's Deli? They call it Lenwich now. And everybody thinks it's a Jewish guy who opened a Jewish deli. It's a guy from South Korea who came to New York in the 80s with probably $10 in his pocket, and he noticed the Jewish deli culture. He said, wow, I could do this better. I think it's a great, little niche industry. And so now, he's become probably a multimillionaire, if not a billionaire, and has developed.
king of Schmear, right?
Yeah, bagel and a schmear. But he's developed, Lenwich they have great products. But
here's why I still love New York. So I still have a place in the city, and on the corner of 21st Street and 7th Avenue, a bodega opened. The bodega is owned and run by a bunch of I think they're all Pakistani. I'm pretty sure they're all Pakistani, because I know my music and they're always blaring Pakistani music. But the place is called the Korean Deli, right? It's Kahrian. It's the Korean Deli, right? Like, they obviously came to New York like, oh, we got to open a Korean deli. Perfect.
Because at one point,
kind
the
of
Koreans
cultural,
ran all the bodegas. Now it's the Yemenites. There's a lot of people from Yemen and also from Pakistan, as you said. So every generation it changes. But yeah, the Korean Korean bodegas were a thing. And how about Woodstock? Like, I remember the Village Green on a Sunday with a drumming circle. Is that what inspired you to go into public space planning, the Village Green?
No. In fact, not. But I'm all for it. I live about almost a mile from the center of town, and we hear the drums echoing through the woods, like the djembe call, the djembes. Yeah. No, it's interesting. I was on the housing committee here in Woodstock. There's the same issue that we've had. This is pre-COVID. It's the same sort of issue as everywhere else. It's sort of a matter of gentrification and lack of housing for not just the creative community that has always made Woodstock what Woodstock is, but for just service workers. It got to the point where, and primarily because of Airbnb and that phenomena, there are very few places that are long-term rentals in town, and very few houses where a young family, for instance, could afford to buy. And so now post-COVID, it's worse than ever. So that sort of gentrification and push away from New York, and due to pandemic and remote work habits and the rise of technology is completely changed this town as well.
You could always go to Kingston, right? Or Saugerties.
Well, actually, it's funny you should mention Kingston. So Kingston, which is, for your listeners, info, should this make the cut in the edit, Kingston, which is always is a city of about 125,000 people, has always been a very downtrodden at best kind of town. Started getting people to move up there, and feels healthier and healthier. Well, it turned out during COVID in the past year, the real estate values in Kingston went up more than any other single place in America.
Wow.
Wow. Right. It is truly, a new Brooklyn on the Hudson.
Wow.
And the houses literally have places in Kingston that were $125,000 2 years ago, or $700,000, $800,000, $900,000 now. which means that if you're a young family, you're shit out of luck because you can't move there anymore.
Wow. Well, this has been an incredibly enlightening conversation on so many different levels. And I feel like we tackled a lot of different arts and culture and events topics. And thank you so much for joining us, Chris. Can we end on a optimistic note for our young producers out there? I think my question for you will be to finish us off with this incredibly enlightening interview is, what is your main piece of advice for those who are young artists wanting to get involved in production and event production specifically?
You know, I have oddly enough been asked this question before, and I usually just answer by saying, just go out and do it. Just do it. Pick something to do and do it. If you want to like produce concerts for a living, just go produce a concert. Find some people who, you know, play music that you like or don't like that you think will be successful, and just find a place and do it. You know, if you want to do theater, like put on a show. I mean, there's no better way of learning in this world, I think, than going out and making it happen. And the other thing is, I think one of the issues that I have noticed and felt from the last few years, especially in teaching and working with, you know, younger folks, is that there's this feeling that you don't have to pay your dues, right? That there's this feeling that you should be able to be, you know, a 25-year-old producer with a Broadway hit, right? That, you know, everyone feels that they should be the next internet tycoon. And it's just, I mean, it happens, you know, it does happen, but it doesn't happen often, right? And the reality is you have to work your ass off for a long time. You have to do a lot of stuff. You have to eat crow, and you should work with other people, even if you have to fetch them coffee, who can teach you, because that's part of the process. You know, there's nothing wrong with being an apprentice, unless you're Donald Trump's apprentice, right? And learning the ropes by doing.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Chris. We really, really, really appreciate you coming in today and speaking with us and sharing all of your exciting stories and memories with us. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Be well. I'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you so much, Chris.